Good evening. My name is Kareem Smith. I am the UNICEF Communications Associate with the UNICEF Office for the Eastern Caribbean. Welcome to another edition of Children's Rights in Focus, where we delve into the issues facing children across the region, but specifically in relation to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As you know by now, we are in the Eastern Caribbean, but across the world, celebrating the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the 35th anniversary of the convention. Last time, we heard from renowned children and women's rights activist, Senator Hazel Thompson Ahi, who is an attorney at law and, as I said, a children and women's rights activist. And she gave us an introduction into the Convention on the Rights of the Child and in relation um, to the foundational principles around the convention, as well as some of the protection rights. Now, for tonight's discussion, across the Eastern Caribbean, we all have varying understandings of words like abuse, violence, um, and there are also varying social definitions of exactly what that constitutes in relation to children. There are certain forms of physical or sexual injury that are widely accepted as abuse, but there are other circumstances under which the lines are can appear to be a bit blurry, and that's particularly with regard to forms of punishment. But what does the Convention of the Right on the Rights of the Child say? What's the convention's position on these issues? To discuss these and other topics this evening are two very distinguished panelists. The first is Miss Faith Marshall Harris, who is a Barbadian attorney, an advocate, and former magistrate. She has a strong background in law and human rights, and she has dedicated her entire career to protecting the rights of children and families. Ms. Marshall Harris has served in various roles, including as magistrate, as I said, legal counsel, and UNICEF champion for children. Her work has focused on issues such as juvenile justice, child abuse, and family law. Ms. Marshall Harris, thank you so much for joining us. And secondly, Ms. Priyanka Lalla, who is an 18-year-old youth advocate from the Eastern Caribbean, hailing specifically from Trinidad and Tobago. Named the UNICEF Youth Advocate in 2020, she's dedicated to promoting children's rights, especially education, protection, and health. Her work has gained global recognition with endorsements from Nobel Peace Laureate Juan Manuel Santos and former UN Human Rights Ambassador Mary Robinson. Priyanka is a published author and has contributed to discussions on children's environmental rights. She's committed to creating a positive future for her region and inspiring others to take action. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. And we want to get right into the discussion. And firstly, um, I want to ask you, Ms. Marshall Harris, about the Convention on the Rights of the Child in relation to violence against children. What does the convention tell us about this issue?
Well, I should first say, are you hearing me well?
Loud and clear.
Right. Yeah, I should first explain that why I think that I can speak to this issue about what the convention says and how it's interpreted, because for the last 5 years, I have sat on the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child as one of the global experts. There are only 18 of us. And what we do is we interpret the convention, and we also monitor countries, examine countries, and review countries as to what they're doing in terms of all these issues. So, one of the things that we have interpreted the convention to state is that Article 37 requires states to ensure that no child shall be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And in another article of the Convention, Article 19, we require states to take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence. So, actually, the approach of the convention is very broad based, um, and covers all forms of violence. And these would include not just physical or mental violence, but injury, abuse, neglect, negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation. Um, and in fact, the interpretation then fine tunes itself for us by way of our general comment, but we can come to that later. But we have a very broad based definition of what constitutes violence against children.
Thank you. And Priyanka, your thoughts on this Article 37 and what it means for children and young people in the Eastern Caribbean.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, looking at the CRC as a whole, it's an international agreement on children's rights, and it's the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history. It's an ongoing commitment to ensure that every child has every right. And Article 19, for example, addresses violence against children. It emphasizes that state parties must have proper laws to prohibit violence, but it also requires states to implement administrative, social, and educational measures to protect children. And UNICEF recognizes the violence is often rooted in broader societal issues such as poverty, discrimination, or even lack of education. And likewise, UNICEF has many initiatives and programs to build awareness of what violence looks like. As we all know, in the Caribbean, parents reprimand children with physical punishment, as we call it, licks. And it highlights the important gap that we need to address and really ensure that the CRC is meeting the needs of the children and ensuring that it is mandated to meet marginalized groups and ensure that we close that gap to ensure safety, security, and protection. And it also highlights, I think, an importance to train parents, teachers, caregivers, guardians, and understand that it is a multifaceted opportunity to educate and enhance our system to ensure that we are all contributing to ensuring and upholding the CRC. It's not only one sector or one organization who this responsibility falls upon, but it is a multi-sectoral approach. And I think these articles really highlight this and also the gaps we see highlighted as well.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. And very well said. Now, Ms. Marsha Harris, um, and Priyanka alluded to one of those areas where she spoke about, she mentioned corporal punishment, which is usually referred to or often referred to as licks, as she said. In your experience, however, what are some of those specific issues around violence against children that are especially concerning in the Eastern Caribbean?
Well, the main concern that we have, and speaking as an attorney at law, this concerned me for a very long time, in that we almost see that there should be a level of legalized violence against children because legislation prior to the reforms that we're seeing now actually provided a defense for the administering of corporal punishment in schools. And of course, this would be contrary to what the CRC believe is indicating, that there should be no form of legalized violence against children, and which would include the corporal punishment. What has happened through with the legislation in Eastern Caribbean, but we say we're in reform at the moment, that there used to be defense for administering corporal punishment in the realm of reasonable punishment. So that literally there are cases in Barbados, for example, called mayors um, and the Crown, which actually said, yes, there's a level of corporal punishment, physical violence, which is permitted. But that is contrary to the concepts of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we ratified in 1990, along with most Caribbean countries. Um, so that our biggest concern really right now in the Caribbean is getting rid of this concept that there can be a form of violence against children which is permitted. Let me tell you what the status is now, because we are in a process of reform. For example, in Barbados, we have just passed the Child Justice Act and the Child Protection Act, and that they do go some way towards eliminating the scourge, because that those two bits of legislation state that the state may not administer corporal punishment in any institution run by the state. Obviously, that covers things like detention centers for children or child care centers. And at the same time, it repealed the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act, which provided a defense if you did beat a child, and there was legal action. In that act was contained the defense that this was reasonable punishment for a child. But having repealed that act, what it leaves it open to the fact that you can now, and there's no defense. However, persons like myself feel that it should be expressly stated in order to get rid of corporal punishment. In the rest of the Eastern Caribbean, they're also in that zone of reform. So a number of the countries have been getting rid of and putting in bits of legislation that would outlaw corporal punishment, but it's not complete. Because one of the problems is that corporal punishment in schools is controlled by the Education Act. So in Barbados, it's still permissible because the Education Act has not been repealed or reformed yet. Hopefully, it will be some time. And for example, in St. Kitts, I know that they've got some form of amelioration in the sense that they permit corporal punishment, but it must be for punishment of last resort, and their conditions for planning, which of course is not satisfactory to us at the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but it's a step towards improvement. The Where we are in Trinidad, I should mention, they have, I understand, got rid of corporal punishment as well in schools, which is again some advance. We in the Caribbean, we are in a state of flux on this, which is sad because of the ambivalence. The countries, the populations, unfortunately, still favor corporal punishment, almost, and saying it's we culture, which of course is not an acceptable explanation for assaulting a child, because we regard it as an assault. And assaulting an adult is against the law. So our argument is, why should it be not against the law for a much more vulnerable human being? Uh, but unfortunately, because there's a level of social acceptance of corporal punishment, the ability to ban it in all settings immediately, obviously, is difficult. And what I have been advocating constantly is that we have to have a national campaign of training and teaching of parents how to do positive parenting. And let me say here and now that UNICEF has a fantastic booklet, which they put out in 2017, on positive parenting, that I'm hoping that they would repeat and we could
Yeah,
really distribute.
yeah. All points well made, Mrs. Marshall Harris. But there was one thing that I did want to ask you, and you mentioned the idea of corporal punishment being somewhat cultural or somewhat ingrained um, in the culture of parenting and discipline, supposedly in the Caribbean, and certainly in the Eastern Caribbean. But you said that this is something that uh, child rights advocates like yourself reject. But is there not something to be said about custom and culture in terms of how a society is governed, or how a society chooses to govern itself? How do you respond to persons that say,
When
So,
if you look at it from a global perspective, let me tell you that it's not every cultural practice that is not necessarily a harmful practice. The fact that we say it is cultural does not make it necessarily good culture. There are a number of things that over the years we have recognized as we modernize that they are not, they're harmful, they're not good for children, I've rejected them. So I don't accept that because we have grown up with this, that it is necessarily good for children. And of course, the neuroscientists can speak to you quite well about that, about the harm that is done. Don't mind people tell you that they were better for it. This is not quite so. It can have lots of harmful effects on children. And we should reject the idea that because it is something that came out of our historic links, first with the colonial links with Britain, where it was part, caning was part of that culture. It also came with our African roots, and because it was also part of the slave society, does not necessarily mean that we should not now reject it at this stage as harmful.
thank you, and well said. I want to bring in Priyanka now to respond to some of what has been shared. What are your thoughts on this? Is it is corporal punishment legalized violence, as has been purported, or is there some space, some circumstances under which we ought to consider our culture within the Caribbean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's necessary to consider our culture. As a Caribbean region, we recognize our unique cultural circumstances within our communities, with our home environments. And in order to apply the solutions and apply the policies and the laws and the initiatives to meaningfully improve the lives of our children, we need to create solutions that are representative of our people and their issues, their challenges, and what the statistics are showing. The importance of children and youth in also mitigating these risks are crucial. We need child rights advocacy to emphasize that corporal punishment violates children's rights as outlined in the international agreements like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which can strengthen advocacy efforts, highlighting the need for governments to uphold their commitment to protect children's rights, which can create pressure for legislative change. We need public awareness campaigns to raise awareness about negative impacts of corporal punishment on child development, which can shift public perception. Educational campaigns can inform parents, educators, and community leaders about the benefits of nonviolent discipline methods and also in the long-term consequences of corporal punishment. We can collaborate with various stakeholders, including child protection agencies, educational institutions, healthcare providers, and NGOs, which can ultimately create a unified front for advocating for the ban. And this coalition can amplify voices calling for a change and provide a comprehensive approach to addressing this issue, working with policymakers to develop evidence-based policies that promote positive discipline practices can facilitate that transition away from corporal punishment. And providing research and data on effective alternatives can also help policymakers make more informed decisions. We can also implement training programs for parents, teachers, caregivers on positive discipline techniques, which can ultimately also empower them to adopt non-violent methods. Providing resources and support can also ease that transition from corporal punishment, which is also something outlined in the voices of our parents, our caregivers, and the children. I've participated in many focus groups, and they desire that support, they want that support, and they ultimately need it. So it's crucial to understand and address cultural beliefs surrounding discipline. Engaging communities in discussions about the values of nonviolence and respect for children's rights can foster acceptance and alternative disciplinary methods. By employing these strategies, we can create a more supportive environment for governments to take action against corporal punishment and ultimately foster a culture that prioritizes the well-being of rights of children. So while the situation may seem daunting, we need to understand our cultural role, we need to understand our community, our history, but more importantly, how we move forward and how we engage with all stakeholders throughout society to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. And you've jumped the gun on me just a little bit in terms of proposing some of those solutions and ways that governments, youth advocates like yourself, of course, and organizations like UNICEF perhaps can do a bit more to advance this agenda. But I want to take us just a bit, because you spoke about awareness about the impact that corporal punishment can have. And I want to ask Ms. Marshall Harris, on that point, in your research and in your work over the years, what is the impact of corporal punishment on children and young people? Because we know what we've committed to in
Mm.
signing on to the CRC, but how does this really affect young people?
Well, there are two levels of knowledge on this. And in fact, I'm about to publish a study along with a doctoral, Barbadian doctoral students studying in Cambridge about the neurology, what the neuroscientists say about the effect of corporal punishment. But before we get to that, one of the things that we both can acknowledge, I think, all three of us can acknowledge, is that the first difficulty with corporal punishment is that it's going to create a cycle of violence. It teaches children that in order to settle a difference, in order to get compliance, you inflict pain and you inflict pain and humiliation on a person. That's the first thing that they learn from being beaten as children. And in fact, and I've been a parent myself, I'm conscious that actually, a child does not necessarily learn any great values from corporal punishment. What they learn to do is to fear corporal punishment, but they don't actually learn anything. The message is not necessarily there. You have not inculcated anything. So the first difficulty one has with corporal punishment is that it does not do what it sets out to do in terms of discipline, because your child has not necessarily internalized whatever the message you're sending. The next thing is that it becomes generational, because children who have been beaten into compliance invariably think, well, that's the way to go with child rearing, so that's how they're going to raise their own children. The other difficulty, and this is particularly in the Caribbean, and I know in Latin America too, that we are seeing an explosion of gang violence and violence in schools and young people. And a lot of the researchers have said that this often is as a result of learning violence almost at your mother's knee, that this has to be part of your life. In Barbados, as you know, we are struggling with the gang violence, and you see it in Haiti, you see it around the Caribbean. And adding to that, the corporal punishment lesson that we're giving children can only create that cycle of violence that we're trying to get rid of. In other words, then you almost create countries where I think I read a statistic only today that the Caribbean is, in terms of violence among young people, is easily top of the table. Um, and corporal punishment, therefore, teaches very little except to reinforce the notion of violence. The question, of course, that the psychologists and psychiatrists have pointed out is that violation of one's physical autonomy, bodily autonomy, actually has serious psychosocial effects which are damaging to the person. The what needs to happen for us is to get out of that cycle of violence. And I know it's extremely difficult, and that people have to be brought to this, because of course one can talk about banning corporal punishment tomorrow. But I recognize that if you just ban by legislation, you literally might just criminalize the population without being able to enforce it. People feel that they sort of beat their children at home. And the point though is that you then have, as our guest said, You've got to bring your population to have the buy-in. You've got to have them taught how to positively discipline, not punish, but discipline positively, in a way that actually reinforces all the good values for children without necessarily making them feel pain or humiliation in the process. I want to stress that the concept of corporal punishment is not popular, for example, in a banning, sorry, of corporal is not popular in Barbados just now, for example, because there's been an explosion of this violence in the community among young people. And they say to you, well, that's because you're getting soft with the corporal punishment. It's not because you're not beating like before. That's why so much of this is happening. And therefore, a lot of people now want to adopt the lick and lock up, philosophy. My point to them is I think actually it's going to exacerbate the problem. The more you beat, and I'll give you an example from my days sitting as magistrate in the juvenile court. Most of the young offenders I saw were boys. And those same boys, and I actually wrote a study in collaboration with UNICEF on this. Most of those boys were the very children who were beaten from the moment they opened their eyes. They got licks and lashes and so on. And it only led to more and more delinquency and deviant behavior. So that's why when I became convinced, when I was a magistrate, that it doesn't work. Because my point is, why did nothing was learned from all that corporal punishment that those boys received? And it seemed to me that they only grew more rebellious, more difficult to handle, because they've tried to me in the court. Nobody is interested in me. They only want to beat me. They don't want to hear me. They're not interested in how I feel about anything. They look every time my mother look at me, she wants to pick up a strap and beat me. And as you know, this is part of, especially sadly, part of a situation where you have single mothers, lots of children. She's frustrated, angry because she's the butcher, the baker in the candlestick maker in the home. She's doing everything, and she gets very resentful. The point is that we've got to move away from this. And let me just end by saying, because I get very passionate on this subject, that I don't know how we're going to manage this, but we are among the countries that have committed on the SHEs that we are going to get rid of all corporate punishment by 2030. I am not seeing many signs that we are moving, and this is 2024. But I am forever hopeful.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go to Priyanka on the issue of the community violence and bullying and what our response should be to that. But I do want to pose this to you though, Mrs. Marshall Harris, and I know that as you said, you did quite a bit of work in Barbados in relation to child justice legislation, in relation to child protection legislation. Yes. Um, One of the things that I saw very often, especially from critics of or persons who had queries or questions about this legislation, is that it was seeking to take the power of parenting away from parents, um, and tipping it in favor of the state. How do we respond to that? And at what point um, does the state and the law need to, you know, release the autonomy of child rearing back into the hands of the parent?
Well, you must remember this Article 5 of the Convention, which speaks to parental rights and responsibilities. And the fact that parents they're the first call for being responsible for the rearing of children. And they are. And whenever I heard this criticism of the legislation, I always say to people, why don't you go back to the legislation and actually read it? I counted that the number of times the Child Justice Bill, for example, mentioned the parent and the mother was almost every other line, because it saw the first base as the parent. To the extent where at one stage when we were developing the legislation, I was a little worried because it seemed almost to tilt in favor of the fact that a parent could abuse a child and still the state would say, but the child must remain with the parents, because there's a balance that has to be achieved here. And as if you read that legislation carefully, you see it gives almost in every clause the right, it respects the rights and responsibilities of parents and family. Because, of course, in the Caribbean, we recognize that there's not just biological parent, there's social parenting, and so you have to recognize that a lot of children are brought up by grandparents, for example. So that is what is reflected in that legislation. And it is heavily weighted in favor of giving the rights of parents and caregivers the greatest say in what's happened. Not a greater necessarily than the child. The child has to stay as well, but the state does not have the biggest say. It is the parents that are given, that have the emphasis. If you read the legislation, that is what it says. I know this was something that people kept talking about, but I think they were ill-informed because they hadn't read what was actually there. You also must recognize, of course, that there is the famous Gillett case, which reminds us that parents are responsible for children up until the point where the child can, by evolving capacity, make some choices for itself. In other words, you have to give way. Parents must give way to a certain amount of the capacity of the child, because this is absolutely necessary. If we say that our definition of a child is a person under the age of 18, you can't suddenly one morning wake up at 18 and be fully adult, mature, and looking after yourself. From at a certain stage, and this is something that we acknowledge in the committee, you must start to give a child an element of responsibility according to their capacity. And this is where parents have gone to understand that their responsibility must be in balance to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive response. And now I want to ask Priyanka to respond to something that you would have mentioned earlier, and that has to do with the prevalence of violence, perceived deviance, bullying. There's some would say that there is a crisis in terms of violence in our schools, and the question is, are we to respond to that um, in a way, as Ms. Marshall Harris suggested, in a way that is soft. And I mean, when you're talking about persons in the adolescent stage, approaching 16 and 17, who are often referred to in Barbados as big hardback men or big hardback women, what is the approach? If corporal punishment is not the answer, then what is the approach?
Absolutely. Well, I think definitely the issue of violence in schools and bullying is a paramount issue. Children deserve to be protected from all forms of harm and abuse, including in their school systems. And violence against children and young people is escalating in homes and in schools. And we're seeing this even locally in Trinidad and Tobago. It's in the newspapers or in the news on the TV station almost every other day. And the bullying and the apparent inability to arrest the bullying in schools is a significant concern for me. Even as a secondary school student, I just turned 18 a month ago, and it's a prevalent issue within the classroom environment, within all secondary schools ultimately. And children deserve education, recreation, freedom to express themselves and be included in discussing the challenges and solutions for their viability. And this is where we bring in intergenerational discussion and intergenerational partnerships to ensure that we really are targeting the needs of our young people, of our children. And I think your report has done a great job of the data collection regarding this issue. For example, I attended a school visit with your reports a year or two ago, and I spoke to some of the students who were my age, and one of the students actually recently messaged me on Instagram and said that she had subsequently left the school. Her mother had taken her out because of bullying and her attempt to commit suicide and other mental health implications, which really highlights the severity of this issue. And she's just an example of one of so many young people in the country and in the region who are ultimately facing a lack of safety, a lack of protection in their school system, an environment that is supposedly a safe space. So an example that I'd like to give is when I was 12, after I became a child rights ambassador, I visited the TTPS Child Protection Unit on how to identify bullying and how police officers can play an integral role in participating in child protection. So I gave out UNCRC posters to all the police stations across the country, and I educated officers on the basic child rights and how children feel in circumstances when their rights are being infringed, and the responsibilities of children, and likewise the responsibilities of officers to treat children accordingly. So like this, addressing bullying in schools requires a comprehensive approach that involves the students, educators, parents, and ultimately the community. Schools should develop and enforce clear anti-bullying policies to identify, to set procedures for reporting incidents, and to specify consequences for those who engage in bullying behavior. I even did an anti-bullying campaign at my school with my school club. And so many issues came up in the roles of bullying in the school system. It's not just the bully and the victim, it's the bystanders, the teachers, the guardians, those responsible, those who instigate the bullying, those who contribute behind the scenes. There's so many multifaceted roles that we need to understand in this issue. And it's just an example of all the child rights issues that we're seeing across the board. It's not just what we see at face value. It's ultimately what's behind that. What's the motivating factors, and how do we target those to ensure that our children are ultimately protected? So initiatives that promote inclusivity, diversity, and respect for differences can help achieve this. Encouraging positive relationships among students can also help reduce instances of bullying. Implementing anonymous reporting systems that allow students to report bullying incidents without fear of retaliation ensure that students know how to report bullying and feel safe in doing so, and that their concerns will be taken seriously. And we've seen an outreach with this through the Child Protection Unit and the Gender Affairs Unit of Trinidad and Tobago. They have a hotline and they have various mental health services that they have created to ensure that children feel safe and comfortable in this process. We also need to integrate social emotional learning to ensure that our school curriculums help students develop empathy, conflict resolution, and emotional regulation skills. These skills can empower students to handle conflicts constructively and reduce bullying behavior. Educate teachers and staff on recognizing signs of bullying and intervening effectively. Staff should be trained to respond appropriately to bullying incidents and create a supportive environment for all students. Empowering bystanders also to take action when they witness bullying, teach them how to safely intervene or report this behavior, and reinforcing ultimately that everyone has a role to play in preventing bullying. And it can create a great impact. Recently in Trinidad and Tobago, we saw a case where a 15-year-old boy committed suicide because of bullying, and his teachers had to walk him home just a few days before his suicide because they feared for his safety that he would be attacked on his way home from the bullies. He was not safe in his school environment. His parents had made continuous complaints to the school administration about the bullying incidents, but nothing had taken place for over 4 years. So even though we have the reporting, we have some procedures, there's still a huge gap, and we need to close that gap by ensuring all stakeholders are included meaningfully, because ultimately we are playing with people's lives, we're playing with children's lives. So facilitating these initiatives and these activities, as simple as encouraging teamwork and collaboration and friendship among students, is imperative. Programs like buddy systems or peer mentoring can help build positive relationships and reduce that isolation. And Caribbean Safe Schools Initiative, as you know, has made major strides in these efforts by implementing these measures so that schools can create a safer and more supportive environment for all their students and ultimately reduce the incidence of bullying and promote a culture of respect and inclusion. So this demonstrates that it truly is a multifaceted approach, and it comes down to the simple skills and values that we learn in a classroom environment. As a student, I even see the need for this with some of my peers within classroom environments, outside of classroom environments, with extra school activities. It's really about building that support system in our school environments and targeting it there, because we often forget that these skills and values aren't taught in many home environments. So we need to use our school systems to foster that safe, comfortable, and nurturing environment. And ultimately, remember that these are children and young people we're dealing with. They're innocent, ultimately, their brains are still open to development, still open to learning new values, new experiences, and understanding the world around them. So if we implement these strategies from a young age and start now, we can work towards reimagining that environment. It's not a lost cause, and it cannot be a lost cause for the future of this country and their children, and for the future of our region's children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priyanka. And obviously, this is something that hits very close to home in your mind, and we all, uh, our thoughts and prayers, of course, are with the family of that young man who died by suicide as well. And we're gonna move on to another topic, but very very briefly, uh, Mrs. Marshall Harris. Um, we're talking about issues again like bullying um, and consequences um, in circumstances where bullying causes serious damage, and in some cases results ultimately in loss of life. The question still remains: how do we respond as a society? The persons who are on the other end of the spectrum in terms of perpetrating these types of things, how do we treat to those persons? How do we respond? And is there a space for what you refer to as positive discipline or positive parenting? um how do we respond?
Well, sorry, you probably have to define the we there, because certainly there are several levels of we. Are we speaking
as a
parents? Are we speaking?
as a society, and there, of course, there are elements to that. The community is one, but I'm speaking more specifically about the state on one hand, and the family on the other.
Right, because you see, I think that we have to divide the response that we're speaking of. We have to divide it between what is uh, at the level of the non-governmental response, and there's also the governmental response. And quite honestly, I thought that your guests have answered the question on what can be done at the level of non-governmental and community level. I think that that has been covered.
Agreed.
What, yeah, what I
Agreed.
think, what the only thing that I would add is what is to be done as a government, as a state. What is needs to happen? And this may sound as if it's not intended to be punitive, but there has got to be some consequence to um, bullying and so on. And as I pointed out earlier, I think that the absurdity of all that has a consequence of there being so much violence in the society. And I will just tell you a story because it may sound strange to you, but I spend nearly, well, half the year, let's say between one third and half the year in Geneva, Switzerland, and the rest of it in Barbados. And when I arrive in Barbados, I am immediately conscious of the uptick in violence. And this is by the way we talk to each other, the way we treat to each other is violent, and we don't even recognize it. It's a lot of verbal violence, right? That's the only word I can use. And I think that children obviously they live, they learn this reality. It becomes their reality that there's a violent response to everything, and the bullying in schools comes out of that. It comes out of the community in which they live. And so I think that at a state level, part of the response has got to be a certain amount of therapy. I think we need some therapeutic schools. We need schools. For example, in Barbados, I am sure that there are answers and solutions elsewhere in the region which I have not yet heard of. But for example, in Barbados, we have a number of students in schools who are disruptive. There are and bully and they're bullies and they take advantage of other children. But a lot of it actually comes out of their own conduct disorders, behavior disorders, learning disorders that are undiagnosed. So obviously they do whatever they can to gain attention. What I think needs to happen is A, the diagnosis, and B, those children need to be taken out of that environment and put into schools where they get treatment, where there's therapy. Because I see that there needs to be a therapeutic approach, an approach applied by the state to a lot of the conditions that I see developing in schools. They're not going to be solved in schools because the teacher standing before a class of 30 is not going to be able to deal with that element that actually needs some special attention. I don't mean punitive attention, but therapeutic attention, because all right, let me interrupt myself to say, if you can imagine 3 or 4 children in a class who can't grasp what is happening. They've got a disorder. Nobody's taking and paying attention to it. But what do? They then do what children do. They displace the energy and they seek attention and they're disruptive. I'm suggesting that government need to face that head on and say, look, we've got we suspend children for 2 weeks and then we send them back into the schools. It doesn't work. We have an Edna Nichols Center, which is when I was a master, we always said it's too short. How can you treat what is happening with those children? And those children might be suffering from a number of concerns, which are not just disorders. Some of them come out of the communities in which they're living. Don't you need to really put them into an environment where you can give them individualized attention? That might seem to be, I don't know if that meets the kind of popular approach, but
Yeah,
that would be my approach.
understood. And thank you very much. We do have to move on to um, a few other discussion points, and time is quickly running out. The next area, and we spoke primarily about corporal punishment and issues around corporal punishment. I was looking at some statistics recently, um, out of Barbados specifically, that indicated, I believe, somewhere in the region of about 600 child abuse cases over a short period of time. This this was revealed by Mr. Kirk Humphrey, who's the Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. What concerns do you have around other forms of um of abuse? I'm thinking sexual abuse, I'm thinking emotional abuse, and physical abuse that goes beyond what is generally accepted as corporal punishment.
Well, let me stick a pin there because where I'm coming from, corporal punishment is physical abuse, but we can probably, you may
Right.
not know
No,
that
no, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think, again, when you talk about custom and practice, there was the whole idea of maybe 3 whips with a cane or something like that, which, based on the convention we've established, is not acceptable. Um, but this is not what I don't think that this is what is usually flagged when we talk about persons coming to the law, or the child protection agencies, to say that some person has been abused. But yet we see quite a high number of cases, arising. What are your concerns where that's concerned?
Well, I'm principally concerned about the child sexual abuse because the figures are far too high. Because one case is one is too many, and unfortunately, it was bad enough before COVID, and unfortunately, COVID did seem to me to kick up the numbers of children who were subjected to sexual abuse. And my concern is not just about the incidence of child sexual abuse, but but how it is treated to it at various levels. I am personally involved through a helpline charity that I also run, where I'm conscious of the fact that the response by law enforcement is not adequate. I don't think that they're trained to be sensitive to the cases of child sexual abuse. That's one of the biggest difficulties. I also see a difficulty where, and this was so from the time I was on the bench, the mothers, because a lot of the child sexual abuse is against girls. Not that they're not, it's not some against boys, but the vast majority is against girls. Very often, mothers are very slow to believe in the sexual abuse, especially where it occurs in the home, and there's a fair amount of it in the home. So very often you don't get parents supportive enough, but that is beginning to change, I'm happy to say. Law enforcement can be quite slow to act. There's also this sense of cover up that a lot of, and so therefore children are not really encouraged to speak out against the abuse. We don't give them that sense of empowerment that, that this has happened, it's wrong, and I must speak against it. I cannot tolerate it. We need to do far more of that. But then my final concern with the child sexual abuse is that in the sometimes these cases could be 6, 8 years before they're heard. So if you imagine, if you will, that a 10-year-old girl has been sexually abused, and luckily parents have persisted to get her justice. You've got law enforcement who's collected the evidence, and then it languishes in the courts. By the time that girl she's up in the court and she's 17 or 18, you know, the court does not see, they should see, but it's one of their human beings. They're not seeing the 10-year-old anymore. They're seeing a big girl, a 17 and 18-year-old girl. And this is one of the saddest things in our community, that those cases take far too long and they need to be fast tracked for the sake those children lose their entire childhood before they get justice, and that bothers me a great deal. I'm not hearing you. Sorry.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that response. And I'm now going to pose a similar question to Priyanka. What has been, and without, of course, getting too personal, of course, what has been your experience as um, a young woman, and the experience of your peers, and what do you see are some, what do you consider to be some of the shortcomings of our society and our systems in being able to respond to issues of sexual violence?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think the issue has a far-reaching implications for health, safety, and of course the well-being of children as a society as a whole. According to the Newsday here in Trinidad and Tobago, the Children's Authority in 2023 reported over 10,000 reports of child sexual abuse in 8 years, with the most frequent age group being children aged 10 to 13. So this figure, among so many other stories, cases, and injustices, represents that the country's and the region's failure to properly protect its children. And child rights and human rights can truly only be guaranteed if there are those committed to the constant vindication. So there have been several reports of child abuse and exploitation under the watch of even the Children's Authority in our school systems on the so-called safe spaces. The children of Trinidad and Tobago, and ultimately the children of our region, do not feel safe. And this is alarming. And this is information that I've even gathered from focus groups and speaking with young people my age throughout the region. So I think definitely there is a major issue at hand, and some of the things that have already been implemented to combat this is the solutions of you report and the safe spaces to report abuse with the Children's Authority hotline, or even some of the initiatives of the Gender and Child Affairs Unit here. But there still remains challenges to arrest violence against children, and we're seeing a rise in the cases, and it's becoming alarming day by day. Community programs to educate young people, therefore, on identifying and reporting and seeking justice is imperative in the transition and moving forward, and really ensuring that we are protecting women and girls, we're protecting our young people, our children from cases of sexual abuse and violence. So addressing even areas where we address unemployment with skills. Many mothers go out of work and leave their children at the hands of perpetrators. Empowerment with skills, where we can work from home and address the challenges within the home environment. And clinics for counseling, medical attention, and legal services. One example of this is the one-stop shop in Rwanda. The one-stop shop is a center, and there are many centers actually, which are structures for comprehensive response to addressing gender-based violence and to complement the nationwide efforts by the Ministry of the Health and the National Police and even the Ministry of Justice. So there are initiatives and avenues to address this on a community level, working with legislation, working with policy, and working with government that really target the needs of the people and the needs of the children in the immediate circumstances, and target them when they need our help the most, ultimately. So I think these are some key areas, but also protection from violence and exploitation is important. Governments must prioritize the protection of all children from all forms of violence, abuse, and exploitation. And this includes implementing the enforcement of laws against child trafficking, sexual exploitation, and domestic violence, and also creating safe environments for children, both in homes and communities, where they should be a fundamental goal. And this can be achieved through comprehensive child protection systems, through awareness campaigns, or even through support services for victims. And it can even be enhanced through quality education. Ensuring that all children have access to quality education is essential for their development and for all future opportunities to protect their rights. They have the responsibility to do so and should be empowered to learn how they can do that and feel safe to do that within their own communities. And this is something that has been highlighted in some focus groups that I've done as well. And this also includes investing inclusive education systems to cater the needs of all children, including children with disabilities or children from marginalized groups as well, as we often see high rates of abuse within more marginalized communities. And of course, health and well-being, I think, goes along with the issue of sexual abuse and violence. Children's physical and mental health is paramount. Governments should prioritize access to comprehensive healthcare services, including mental health support, nutrition programs, and even preventative care, which are all ultimately intrinsically linked to these cases that we see on a day-to-day basis. Addressing issues such as even child malnutrition or mental health challenges that come out of these cases, and access to vaccination, and even things like this that we've seen in cases that UNICEF has published, is crucial for ensuring children's overall well-being. I think also promoting healthy lifestyles and addressing the impacts of these factors can also impact the overall holistic process. So while you may not see the direct link on the face value of it, it's so important to realize how all of these areas are so intrinsically linked into the child's experience, and not only what they face, but how they come out of it and how we support that process coming out of it. I mean, ultimately, these are children with a future, and we need to ensure and secure their future by providing the secure services so that they feel safe, they feel comfortable, and they feel empowered to seek help, to seek care, and that the care reaches them. And ultimately, I think these are some preventative measures that can be implemented throughout the process and can be implemented to reduce rates of sexual abuse and sexual violence. I think education is a major one, as I mentioned, and ultimately we are seeing major rates and statistics where there have been increases in violence and sexual abuse against young people in the Caribbean. So really implementing these strategies to decrease these rates is imperative for the future of our children. Thank you.
Could I do you,
Go right ahead.
you're out of time?
No,
Now,
go right ahead. Go right ahead.
yes, I wanted to mention something that, because this is one of the major difficulties with child sexual abuse, is the amount of silence there is around child sexual abuse, because we don't see enough of the cases because there is a silence. And in the legislation that we've just enacted in Barbados, we are seeking to um, get mandatory reporting. That is, that we've incorporated in the legislation that certain duty bearers have a duty to report child sexual abuse wherever they note it. And that this would be like doctors and psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, anybody who deal with children, who work for and with children, are now under the law asked, they're given a duty to report child sexual abuse as they see it, because that is one of the major difficulties we have with child sexual abuse, that literally it goes swept on the carpet, it goes unnoticed, the child doesn't feel empowered to speak out. If they speak out, they're not believed. We are trying to ensure that we get to the root of the problem and we treat that child, because we need that child to be reintegrated, to be treated and reintegrated into their societies. That is one of the things we hope will bear fruit in the future.
Thank you. And there was just one other area in relation to violence against children before um, my final before I pose the final question to you. Of course, the Convention on the Rights of the Child um, under Article 19 speaks beyond physical violence and physical injury and abuse. It speaks also to mental violence um, and neglect. Um,
Mhm.
what are your concerns around those two specific issues in
Oh,
our
that
region?
is a serious problem. And I hesitate to make any claims about knowledge about what's happening in the rest of the region. I'm just about collecting the data now that before my next session in Geneva, which starts next January, on what is happening in the rest of the region. But certainly I can tell you in Barbados that it is a serious issue, the verbal violence that children are exposed to, both as directed to them. In fact, in some instances, I find that verbal violence is worse sometimes than the physical violence, because and I'm sure, Karine, you have heard it yourself, where you hear a mother berating a child because the child is tired, she's been on a long shopping trip in the supermarket for 2 or 3 hours. This child can't manage to sustain that activity. So the child is becoming fretful, or, lagging behind. And you hear the violent language applied to even the tiniest children. It is one of the areas that I am particularly perturbed about. How do we treat to it? It is that we've got to train our parents. Parenting education is our biggest need in Barbados. The fact that we must be able to understand that you need to compartmentalize and break down activities in small bits, because these are little people. And then you've got to not take your frustration out on a child by way of your language. So just the beating is not the only thing. It is the language used to children that is really worrying. Um, that is, the verbal violence is a big issue. the emotional violence. Let me explain to you that I have been dealing with a lot of young persons who run away from home, and we are often told that this people assume that this is because the young person or child is deviant. A lot of our young persons and children run away from home because of the violence at home, and not all of it is physical or sexual. A lot of it is verbal and emotional. And so I worry about the mental health of a lot of our young people because it's manifests itself in ways where they take it out on others, on their peers. And
Exactly.
that is where it's escalating.
Yeah, what about you?
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. Priyanka, your thoughts on this issue of uh, emotional violence and neglect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely a major issue, and we're seeing it locally, we're seeing it regionally, and in some of the work that I've been doing with Europort, major polls have been coming out that mental health and the emotional stress of it is exacerbated, and it continues to grow because the challenges continue to worsen. And I think in addressing it as well, it needs to be a holistic approach, as I've mentioned before, ensuring that when we approach the emotional well-being, we look at the child's full experience. And for example, with effects on children's mental health and emotional well-being, we see signs leading to aggression and anxiety and behavioral issues, even in primary and secondary school systems. So it's really addressing it from the core of the issues once again. And I think also allowing there to be more spaces for mental health and emotional well-being support is crucial. In some of the focus groups I've done, a lot of the students still don't feel that there are safe environments for them to fully express themselves. I think even though the platforms exist, there's still the fear that, will I be outed? Is there really an anonymous aspect of it? Am I, is it, are they going to tell my parents? What's the repercussion of them opening up? And I think that's often something that needs to be addressed, and really ensuring that in creating these safe spaces and these mental health platforms, we're including our young people and children from the beginning of the process. And it's not, we can't create these solutions for young people without young people. I attended a mental health workshop about a year ago with Mr. Bertrand Moses from UNICEF, and I was the only child in the room. Had representatives from the Ministry of Education and various other NGOs looking at mental health in our country. But I was the only youth representative and the only youth voice. And I didn't get to share my opinion or my perspective until the very end of the session, when many of the guests had already left. So really and truly, in ensuring that we're creating these spaces for young people, ensure that there's no tokenism, ensure that we are prioritizing their perspectives, their experiences, and we're truly taking them into seriousness when we look at the legislation, we look at the policy, make sure that it's reflective of what they're seeing in these spaces. And I think UNICEF has done a great job of creating these safe spaces for young people to voice their concerns about the school systems, outside these school systems, and the various mental health concerns they face as well. And I think even, as I mentioned, targeting our education systems, ensuring that we have guidance counselors available, ensuring that we also target parents and guardians within this mental and emotional support, because as I said, it also comes from the home environment. We look at positive parenting and how we can encourage parents to adopt these positive parenting styles. Even that is a contributing factor, as we've seen today, and just including practical tips and strategies for that effective communication within the household, in the school system, and in other safe spaces like clubs and activities. And this is something that's come out in many of my conversations with young people from the age of 12 to 17. They want these safe spaces and they want to feel seen and heard, but they also want to be part of that decision making. And part of that process, because ultimately when they receive the opportunities or receive the spaces for this, it's not representative or conducive of their needs or of the challenges they're facing. So really, I think within targeting mental and emotional wellness as a major issue, it really needs to have that intergenerational approach and have our policymakers, our legislators, our governments ensure that we are hearing the voice of our children and have that intergenerational collaboration, because we ultimately can't have effective programs without each other. So it's really ensuring that as we move forward, and I think that's something that's really stood out to me in my advocacy and in my collaboration with youth throughout the region. Thank you. Oh, Kareem, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. And finally, as we're just about out of time, I want to invite both of you first, with Mrs. Faith Marshall Harris and then Priyanka, to tell us, as we approach the 35th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and for us here, at least most of our territories in the Eastern Caribbean, the 34th year it will be for us. What do you consider to be, or what do you think should be the key priorities for governments as it relates to children's rights?
Well, I was about to tell you, and it can be one of your aims. This booklet that I'm showing you is an excellent booklet that UNICEF once produced. Brilliant. I would like to see you distribute this throughout the length and breadth of the Eastern Caribbean.
Yeah,
Um,
we do have some copies still in our office, and
yeah,
I 100% agree with you.
it is really very good. That's one of the things I want us to um, region wide start a whole awareness raising, parental guidance, parent education, an explosion of teaching parents not just about the discipline of this, but also just simply about parenting, because I think that is what really is what we need most now. That a lot of our parents, in fact, we didn't get to touch on it much. At least I didn't. But one of the things too that I'm seeing a lot of in Barbados is neglect of children, in the sense that the children are almost bringing themselves up because parents are partying. They're not there as parents. We need a whole revolution to go on in parenting, to so that children can not only be safe but be nurtured, empowered, and looked after. That's what I would like to see happen, and that could be would be our best bet for the rest of this decade, because the only way we can celebrate the 35th anniversary of the CRC is to build on what we have got to so far, but we need a long way. We've got miles to go before we sleep.
Thank you, Ms. Faith Marshall Harris. And Priyanka, you have the last word. Your three top priorities in 1 minute, if you can.
Absolutely. I think as we approach the 35th anniversary of the CRC, it's essentially what we discussed today, ensuring protection from violence and exploitation. Governments must prioritize the protection of children from all forms of violence, of abuse and exploitation, including enforcing laws against child trafficking, exploitation, as we saw, domestic violence, and really targeting the needs of children in their circumstances, access to quality education, ensuring that all children, despite their background, have access to quality education that prepares them for the skills that they need to be productive, respectful, and empathetic citizens for their development, for all future opportunities, and ensure that these education systems also target the needs of their communities and the challenges that they're facing. And lastly, I think definitely health and well-being, as I mentioned earlier, with children's physical and mental health being prioritized through government programs, school initiatives, even home intervention, including mental health support and preventative care, and including working with more regional organizations, even like Healthy Caribbean Coalition and many of UNICEF's partners, to ensure that we're tackling all sectors and essentially really prioritizing that community development to ensure that those who need these services and this support the most are receiving it, and receiving it meaningfully through the support of these organizations. Thanks very much for having me, and it was a lovely discussion.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our discussion on violence against children and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I want to say a very special thank you to our very special guest, child rights champion Mrs. Faith Marshall Harris, and uh, child rights ambassador, UNICEF Youth Advocate Priyanka Lalla. It was a pleasure discussing these very important issues with both of you. And I do think that our viewers, those who viewed live tonight and who will view in the future, will be very much enriched on it. And I think we have quite a bit of food for thought and food for action as well. To our viewers, thank you as well for joining us as always. And please stay tuned to our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, for details on the next live discussion that we'll have around the Convention on the Rights of the Child at 35. My name is Kareem Smith, and once again, thank you so much for joining us.